The First World War put an end to three mighty empires: the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ukrainian people had spent the previous centuries as subjects of the latter two. Just like many other nations subjugated by these empires, they hoped that this period of great dislocation might give them a chance at self-rule. Unfortunately, the new Russian Empire, also known as the Soviet Union, had other things planned for Ukraine, including the horrific Holodomor, a genocidal famine caused by Stalin's policies that killed millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s. Welcome to our latest video on the history of Ukraine. In our last video, we discussed how the Ukrainian language and culture survived the Russification attempts of the Tsarist regime. In this video, we will explore the Ukrainian attempts at independence following the end of World War I, the Soviet takeover of Ukraine, and the cataclysmic Holodomor. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. In February 1917, the October Revolution swept the 3-century-old Romanov dynasty from power and put an end to monarchy in Russia. The wind of change and the atmosphere of liberty was blowing in Ukraine as well. For centuries, the Russian Empire had rejected seeing Ukrainians as a separate identity, banned the use of the Ukrainian language, and suppressed Ukrainian national self-expression. However, following the collapse of the Romanovs, there was hope among the intelligentsia of the Russian Empire's many minority peoples that the revolution would allow them to reclaim some form of cultural and political autonomy. Thus, in March of 1917, Ukrainian political parties, clergy, businessmen, military servants, workers, and intelligentsia came together to create the Central Rada, a provisional Ukrainian government centered in Kyiv. Mikhailo Hrushevsky, a Ukrainian historian and a socialist politician, was elected the chairman of this new Ukrainian body politic. The Central Rada gradually expanded its base by involving more groups, and by April they started adopting laws. Simultaneously, soldiers of different peoples populating the Russian Empire started calling for their own units. Ukrainian soldiers were not an exception, advocating for the use of the Ukrainian language and the adoption of the military insignia of the Cossack era. The plans of the Central Rada to redistribute land in Ukraine appealed to soldiers. Still, they had a formidable competitor in that respect, the Bolsheviks, who were quite popular among the soldiers at the time due to their calls to end the still ongoing First World War immediately. With the geopolitical situation in the collapsing Russian Empire incredibly precarious, the Central Rada chose a careful way of proceeding with their demands of self-rule for Ukraine. In June 1917, they declared their first universal, where the Central Rada proclaimed that, from now on, we alone will create our life. They added that Ukraine was not separating from Russia, but nevertheless, they were going to govern themselves from then on. This proclamation caused concern in the Russian provisional government, but at the time it was dealing with significant political turmoil inside the country and defeats on the Eastern Front. Hence, they were not in a position to alienate the Ukrainians, and they struck a compromise with the Central Rada. Per this compromise, the Provisional Government of Russia recognized the Central Rada and other Ukrainian governing bodies, and agreed to the creation of all Ukrainian units within the Russian army. In contrast, the Ukrainian authorities agreed not to proceed with autonomy without the agreement of the Provisional Government. It seemed that Ukraine was well on the path to freedom, but things took a sharp turn when the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia in October 1917. In response, the Central Rada proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic on November 20th without formally cutting ties with Russia. Lacking a standing army and only being in control of a handful of urban centers, the Central Rada was vulnerable to the Bolshevik threat. In late December, the Bolsheviks proclaimed the Donetsk-Kryvyi Rog Soviet Republic. Then, in January 1918, the Bolshevik army invaded Ukraine. The Central Rada responded by declaring Ukraine's independence in its fourth universal. Still, the Bolshevik army quickly overwhelmed the Ukrainian army to capture Poltava, Yekaterinoslav, Vinnytsia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and eventually Kyiv after 11 days of shelling. This was followed by a wave of Red Terror against the individuals perceived to be counter-revolutionaries. According to the Rada member Pavlo Christuk, Ukrainian troops shot anyone in Kyiv who spoke Ukrainian and considered himself a Ukrainian. Of course, all this was done not by communists, but by ordinary brothers and comrades under the leadership of officers trained in the old school, similar to the policeman Lieutenant Colonel Muravev, who in his siege of Kyiv took special delight in bombarding the building of the separatist Hrushevsky with heavy artillery, of which he later boasted in public speeches. However, in this dark hour, the German and Austrian governments recognized the Ukrainian People's Republic, sending in their armies in February 1918. By March, they were in Kyiv, together with the Ukrainian army, under Simon Pesliura's command, expelling the Bolshevik army out of Ukraine. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty, signed by the Central Powers and Bolshevik Russia, recognized Ukraine as an independent country. However, the Germans were not Ukraine's saviors, but her new managers, and they had no intention of seeing Ukraine as anything more than their puppet state. With the First World War having been raging for 4 years, Germany was beginning to starve, and desperately needed grain from Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. Throughout 1918, 400,000 German and 250,000 Austrian troops were deployed in Ukraine. The German government was suspicious of the Central Rada, which they saw as too radical and untrustworthy, particularly with respect to the grain they demanded from Ukraine. Thus, the Germans decided to go for a coup to install a more loyal regime. Pavlo Skoropadsky was Germany's choice. Skoropadsky was a descendant of the family which at one point ruled over Ukraine. A staunch conservative, he was a landowning former general of the Russian Imperial Army and a favoured candidate of Ukraine's landowning class. On the 29th of April 1918, the gears began turning. The Rada was forced to resign, and Skoropadsky was proclaimed the hetman of Ukraine. Skoropadsky's reign was short, lasting only 8 months, during most of which Ukraine was practically under German occupation. Nevertheless, he tried to improve the situation in Ukraine with the authority he had. He adopted 500 laws, including a budget law. He tried to carry out land reform, which the Ukrainian landowners and the German government did not universally accept. Skoropadsky was also known for his support of science and education in Ukraine. He opened the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, the National Library, and other intellectual institutions during his rule. By late 1918, the Central Powers were on the brink of defeat, and Ukraine was once again entering a period of turmoil. The Bolsheviks were creating tensions once more, while Nestor Makhno, a wildcard Ukrainian revolutionary, had risen up against the Austrian forces in Zaporizhia. On November 11, 1918, the First World War came to an end, and the fallout would change Ukraine forever. The defeat of Germany and Austria meant that Skoropadsky had lost his patrons. Now other forces were ready to act, such as the Directorate of Ukraine, led by Simon Petliura and several leaders of the Ukrainian People's Republic. In November 1918, they launched a rebellion against the Hetmanate and forced Skoropadsky to abdicate and leave the country. Around the same time, the West Ukrainian People's Republic was declared in the areas around Lviv in October 1918, at the time when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was on the brink of defeat in the First World War. However, this fledgling nation faced issues with Poland, another nation rising from the ashes of the war, which also claimed that area as its own. Indeed, while Ukrainians inhabited the region around Lviv, it was also populated by Poles who rebelled in favor of joining Poland. In November 1918, Poland took Lviv, which began the Polish-Ukrainian War. Ukraine was between a rock and a hard place, simultaneously facing a Polish threat from the west and a Bolshevik threat from inside their country. Needless to say, the internal political turmoil was not helping either. After the defeat in Lviv, a Ukrainian army led by Petliura halted the Polish advance. However, they were not as successful against the Soviet army. By late January, the Soviets were in control of most of left-bank Ukraine, forcing the Ukrainian government to relocate to Vinnytsia. In January 1919, the Ukrainian republics merged by adopting the Act of Union, but this did not change their fortunes much. In February of 1919, the Soviet army captured Kyiv. By April, the Soviets took control of the Black Sea shore, capturing the significant ammunition reserves left behind by the withdrawing Allied troops. By April, the Soviets counterattacked and recaptured Kyiv. By July, the Bolshevik army had overwhelmed entirely the opposing army and captured most of Ukraine. By July, the Bolshevik army had entirely overwhelmed the opposing army and captured most of Ukraine. After years of war, the Ukrainian people were tired. After fighting foes for several years on several fronts, they were not in a position to resist the Soviet occupation. In December 1919, the Ukrainian Soviet government was declared. By 1920, the Bolsheviks defeated Makhno's anarchists and the remainder of the White Army. In 1921, several groups which had remained loyal to the Ukrainian People's Republic launched guerrilla attacks on the Soviet army, but were quickly repulsed. In 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic became one of the founding members of the USSR. Despite what the revisionist pseudo-historians claim, it was the assertion of a separate Ukrainian identity and the creation of a short-lived Ukrainian state that forced the Soviet government to annex Ukraine as a separate political unit, rather than as part of Russia. In fact, the 1924 Soviet Constitution recognized the right of Ukraine and other member states to secede from the Soviet Union, albeit only on paper. As a Soviet republic, Ukraine was largely subject to the same policies which were enacted elsewhere in the Soviet Union. Ukraine suffered from the war communism of the Civil War era, with the forcible confiscation of food causing significant damage. This was exacerbated by the drought of 1921–23, which caused a famine that killed hundreds of thousands. Understanding that they could not rely on coercion to keep the satellite Soviet republics in line, Lenin adopted the new economic policy and nativization, Korenizatsiya. The former allowed private enterprise to a certain extent, and stopped the confiscation of grain, which boosted the Soviet economy and improved the living standards of ordinary people, including Ukrainians. The latter was a policy to revive the identity of non-Russian peoples in a Soviet context, by promoting native languages in education and cultural life, as well as supporting national cadres and national cultures. The purpose was to convey the message that Russia is no longer a prison of nations, as Lenin used to say, but a brotherhood of nations that would prosper within the Soviet Union until they reached the promised land of communism altogether. However, these liberal policies were soon rolled back. As a certain Joseph Stalin was consolidating his power, nativization was substituted with centralization under Russian political and cultural dominance. At the same time, the adoption of the first five-year plan in 1928 essentially meant the end of the new economic policy. Even worse for a massive grain producer like Ukraine was the collectivization of agriculture, which Stalin was about to embark on as well. By the late 1920s, Ukraine started witnessing the first signs of things to come. In 1927, the leaders of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church were accused of counter-revolutionary activity and banned from engaging in religious services. However, the repression started when the Soviet Union started repressing the Ukrainian intelligentsia by accusing them of being part of the so-called Union of the Liberation of Ukraine and conducting a show trial against them. To this day, the existence of this union is still mostly rejected by the Ukrainian public. Nevertheless, Soviet authorities accused the phantasmal separatist organization of plotting to overthrow the Soviet government in Ukraine. The trial that followed sentenced 45 Ukrainian intellectuals, former leaders of the Ukrainian independent state, and members of the clergy. By the mid-1930s, thousands more arrests had been made. The cream of the crop of the Ukrainian nation was systematically eliminated, be they scientists, teachers, engineers, artists, or actors, with the purpose of defeating any dissent to Stalinist policies. And dissent there was going to be, as the next target of the Soviet regime was the largest societal group in Ukraine, the peasantry. In 1927, the Communist Party declared an intensification of the collectivization effort. Initially, this was to be attempted without overt coercion, since the rural areas of Ukraine were already struggling due to a drought that had occurred that year. However, despite the usually effective Soviet propaganda, only 5.6% of the peasant households in Ukraine were collectivized. Hence, in 1929, Stalin called for an all-over collectivization, which meant the Soviet government was going to implement this policy no matter what the people wanted. Thousands of party activists were trained to facilitate the implementation of collectivization. the spring of 1932 was set as a deadline for the completion of the collectivization of Ukraine. Still, overzealous national communist authorities decided to speed up the process to complete the collectivization by 1930. Consequently, an estimated 30% of grain produced in Ukraine was taken out of the country, which obviously led to significant violations and problems. Ukrainian peasants often refused to see their livestock seized from them and slaughtered their animals before the authorities could get their hands on them. As anti-collectivist sentiment grew, many spontaneous peasant revolts occurred in rural Ukraine. In response, the Soviet regime reacted in its usual heavy-handed manner. Thousands of resisting peasants were accused of being kulaks, meaning rich peasants, and were arrested and deported to Siberia and Central Asia. Overall, more than 2 million peasants were deported from Ukraine, with over 300,000 dying in or on the way to prison and labor camps. As collectivization intensified, the Soviet government set an unattainable production quota on agriculture from Ukraine in 1931. In order to meet the quota and escape Stalin's wrath, the local leadership did its utmost to reach this goal at the expense of Ukrainian peasants. Activists used coercion to force the peasants to give up their grain, and those who dared to resist were killed, arrested, or deported. On top of that, a significant amount of the harvest was not collected, lost, or went bad as a result of grave mismanagement by the authorities. Thus, famine in Ukraine started. Even as starvation began to reap a bloody harvest throughout the country, an even higher quota for agricultural output from Ukraine was set for 1932. All attempts made by the Ukrainian Soviet leadership to dissuade Stalin from this were in vain. Moscow called these complaints anti-Bolshevik and stated that there will be no concessions or vacillations in the problem of the fulfillment of the task set by the party and the Soviet government. In his letter to Kaganovich, Stalin complained of the perceived weakness of the Ukrainian party leadership and doubled down on the importance of fulfilling the quota despite a catastrophic situation in the Ukrainian countryside. He believed that if we do not correct the situation in Ukraine immediately, we will lose Ukraine. Correction of the situation meant fulfilling the quota no matter the cost. Thus, even though Stalin knew that his quota was going to be devastating for the Ukrainian peasants, he did not budge from his position. Collectivized farmers who failed to fulfill their quotas were ordered to confiscate whatever meager food reserves people had in their homes. Problems with maintenance and proper management of the agricultural produce persisted as a significant amount of grain was lost or poorly stored, rotting as a result. All the while, Ukrainian food was being exported out of the country, even though people in the country were dying of malnutrition. The only way for many to survive starvation was to steal grain from the collectivized farmers. Stalin tackled this problem by personally drafting the On the Safeguarding of State Property decree, which declared that offenders against collectivized property are to be considered enemies of the people and either be shot or, in extenuating circumstances, imprisoned for not less than 10 years with total confiscation of property. By December 1932, 125,000 starving people were punished under this decree, with 5,400 of them shot. The party leader of Ukraine, Stanislaw Kosio, perhaps best demonstrated the attitude of the Soviet government towards peasants and their resistance with the following remark: "The peasant wants to strangle the Soviet government with the scrawny hand of hunger. We will show him what hunger really is." Many peasants tried to flee the famine in the countryside, hoping for a better situation in the cities. According to the Italian consul in Kharkiv, every night 250 dead bodies of starved people are gathered in Kharkiv. It has been noticed that most of them do not have livers, which are used for baked goods later sold in the market. The Soviet government wanted to prevent the mass exodus of peasants. On the 27th of December 1932, they adopted an internal passport system which prevented peasants from leaving their places of registration. In late January 1933, the government stated that the mass exodus of peasants is organized by the enemies of the Soviet order, by counter-revolutionaries and Polish agents. Consequently, the Soviet regime prohibited the mass movement of the peasantry from Ukraine and North Caucasus to cities with all available means. The Red Army was sent in to ensure peasants stayed in place, while thousands of Ukrainians died in railway stations, hoping in vain to escape starvation. Thousands of orphans of dead Ukrainian peasants were accused of stealing state property, detained and sent to specialized camps or executed. All of this was happening while the Soviet Union continued exporting Ukrainian grain. State reserves of food were available, but Stalin refused to use them to alleviate the suffering. According to the historian Robert Galately, the warehouses in the Poltava province were described as almost bursting with grain. Some estimate that at the peak of the famine in June of 1933, 28,000 people were dying every day of starvation in Ukraine. To the Ukrainian people, this era is now remembered as the Holodomor, which in Ukrainian means murder from starvation. By the end of 1933, the Kremlin finally decided to send some food to Ukraine, but only to farmers working in collectivized lands. The purpose was to maintain agricultural output and save the collectivized peasants who would work for the Soviet state. Ralph Barnes, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Herald, wrote in August 1933 that since the beginning of the famine, 1 million people had died from starvation. Some claim that as many as 6 million people died. It is difficult to determine the exact number of casualties that the Holodomor inflicted, since the authorities were not really keen on reporting deaths caused by their policies in their communist paradise. However, whatever the final body count, the consequences for the Ukrainian people were catastrophic. By the summer of 1933, the Ukrainian countryside was completely devastated, but somebody needed to raise crops in this Chernozem fertile soil. Thus, the Soviet government decided to resettle Russian peasants there. Along with helping with the immediate agricultural output, this decision also meant the settlement of a politically more reliable group in Ukraine. One can argue that this decision still has an impact on Ukraine to this day. Lieber argues that the Holodomor represented more than just a demographic catastrophe for Ukrainians, it also symbolized the collapse of a Ukrainian peasant-centered cultural ecosystem, and the integration of its survivors into a new, uncharted, urban Soviet world. This total war to subdue the Soviet Union's primary granary included brutal attacks on the Ukrainian intelligentsia, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, and the Republic's Communist Party. By the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, the dekulakization and collectivization campaigns and the famine seriously undermined the capacity of Soviet Ukrainian civil society, already weakened by war, revolution and civil war, to resist amalgamation into the Stalinist order. One of the key questions still debated is whether the Holodomor was a genocide. This is a discussion that perhaps warrants a video of its own, but one thing is clear: the policies of Stalin and the Soviet government were the direct cause of millions of deaths. Moreover, Stalin refused to alter the course, even though he was very much aware of the catastrophe happening in Ukraine. Indeed, famine was not exclusive to Ukraine during the collectivization, as a similarly disastrous situation had occurred in the North Caucasus and Kazakhstan as well. However, statements from Soviet leaders at the time indicate that Ukraine was a special case for them. As the Proletaskaya Pravda newspaper wrote on the 22nd of January 1930, the destruction of the social basis of Ukrainian nationalism, individual peasant landholdings, was one of the main goals of collectivization in Ukraine. It is beyond any doubt that collectivization in Ukraine pursued the goal of breaking the back of the peasants, the political class with the most potential in the country. Throughout the first quarter of the 20th century, Ukraine fought a tough fight to gain its independence, caught in between Russia and the Central Powers and then Poland. Alas, just like many fellow nations subjugated by Russian imperialism, it was a losing battle. Ukraine once again was annexed into Russia, this time as part of its Bolshevik iteration. The costly fight for independence gave way to an even worse fate for the Ukrainian nation. The destruction of its national elite through repressions and its peasantry through famine by Stalin has left an indelible mark on the Ukrainian national consciousness. In our next episode on the history of Ukraine, we will cover the fate of the Ukrainian people in the latter half of the 20th century through World War II and beyond. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.